We are Right Out Loud at the University of Delaware, and this month's discussion topic is short stories. So what is a short story?
According to Wikipedia,
the ever-popular and fully knowledgeable source
which
of all
has never been edited by anyone who does not have the proper accreditation to do so,
And it's never wrong.
ever. A short story is a brief work of literature, usually written in narrative prose.
So it's a short story.
Yes. Also, as we discussed earlier in November when we were discussing the difference between novels and everything else, a short story, by the definitions that we found, has to be under 20,000 words. However, again, it depends on what your publisher says a short story is, how the author intends it to be read, how the audience receives it as, and we also decided that it needs to be fictional to be a short story. Otherwise,
We said that a novel has to be fictional, so it makes sense that a short story would have to be fictional as well, to keep our definitions aligned with one another.
yeah, anything
I
else?
don't necessarily agree.
You're a
Shush.
former student, you don't count.
Yeah, you graduated.
Exactly.
You're not even here
I
right
graduated, so I know.
now. Does anyone here write short stories?
I do.
Yeah?
I've never been able to produce anything that's under a novel, because I can't write a plot that happens in a short span of time. I can write small events that happen, but they're usually within a larger thing and don't make context, or don't make sense outside of context. Therefore, I don't consider them short stories.
Well, it's difficult. I'd have to say that a short story cannot necessarily be addressed in the same way you write a novel.
Yeah,
You
it has
need
to be able to stand
restructure.
alone.
Well, yes, that, and also you need to restructure the narrative. The focus of what you're doing in a short story is different from what you're doing in a novel. Usually with a short story, this is generalizing and not necessarily universally applicable or entirely correct. But I'd say short stories usually seem to focus more on a particular moral or a certain character presenting a particular idea rather than a large overarching narrative.
I think that's fair to say. I mean, when I write novels, what I go and do is that I go and figure out what the plot is before I even start writing it. But with short stories, I don't plot them out very much, and I do tend to focus a lot more on specifically what's going on inside the characters' heads, what their psychological state is, or I'm focusing on like a very narrow specific incident. Like I wrote a short story that's about astronauts in a shuttle that's damaged, and I know it's going to be destroyed when they re-enter the atmosphere. So I just wrote a short story in 15 minutes that's that astronaut's thought as he's burning up in the atmosphere.
That sounds lovely. Well, I mean, but it's hard to keep a short story a short story. Like Neil Gaiman, when he wrote Graveyard Book, it originally started as like a 15, 20-page chapter in, was it M for Magic? One of his collections of short stories. But when you read that short story, you think, wow, there's a lot missing here. And then, obviously, Neil Gaiman thought that too, because then he wrote The Graveyard Book, turning his short story into a novel.
Well, again, it comes back to this idea that the scope and focus of a short story is different from a novel. You're trying to achieve something different with the narrative and your presentation of the characters. And also, I think that in a short story, because it is a short story, you have to be similar to the free verse poem. You have to be more careful about what you're doing than you necessarily have to do with a novel. I think it was John Irving who actually talked about this. Don't quote me on that.
It's like what we were saying before when we were talking about poetry, I think, about how you can structure prose in very specific ways, and you know the difference between that and poetry. A short story, it's easier to structure it very finely and write a cohesive prose piece.
I wouldn't say it's necessarily easier. I think that it's necessary.
You have a shorter amount of time. It's easier to write a novel in pi lettering than, or a short story in pi lettering than an entire novel in pi lettering.
That would I agree with. I'd say that, however, in terms of it being easier, I would say in some respects it's actually harder to write a short story because you have, and to structure a short story because you have to confine yourself to a shorter space of time So therefore, you have to be more deliberate and more economic with how you're presenting the story.
I think it depends on maybe how you start out with the story, because I don't have an idea and then decide that's a short story idea or
Yeah,
that's a novel idea.
Yeah, usually it is a novel idea.
See, I actually would do that sometimes. I would come up with an idea for a story and I'll say, this feels more like a short story to me, or this feels more like a novel.
Yeah,
Well-
because I don't see it as being necessarily being restricted to a smaller amount of words, because I feel it's more that you are going to just tell the story. Maybe the story doesn't need so many words to be told.
Yeah, like I read this short story in my short story and novel class, where it was framed something to do with triangle with the eye in it.
The Illuminati?
Yeah, the Illuminati and the that secret group in the United States that's on the back of the dollar bill.
The Illuminati.
The Illuminati.
I think that's who they are. I think.
No, the Masons, Freemasons.
That one, yes.
That one. Okay,
I am a
so
triangle.
apparently the guy who wrote this story was trying to send codes to the Freemasons, and so his story has the character going through like the different elements. Like he falls into water, he feels burning as if he's on fire, he gets covered in mud, and then all the directions in the story actually are mapped out as a circle. Like he goes left, he goes left, he goes right, he goes left. The directions that he's actually physically moving within the story. So I would say in a larger book, all that imagery would be lost, or it would have to be emphasized more so that the reader would know it's important. Whereas in a short story, it's about 10 pages long, it's easier.
Maybe.
Yeah.
No,
What I read.
Oh, the
was
short
about
story was
10
about
pages
10.
long.
Okay, yes.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
in those 10 pages, it's easier to go back and reread the whole thing.
Yeah, exactly. The focus of a short story, in a short story format, you could focus on a detail like that more. That becomes the emphasis of the story as opposed to maybe the narrative trajectory or the sequence of events becomes secondary to some detail like that.
There's a lot
Potentially.
more. There's a lot more implied stuff in short stories.
Yeah.
Whereas if you start at the beginning of a novel, it will usually say something like, "This is your character. This is your motivation.
This is your world if you're in a
Yeah,
fantasy or something.
I'm going to give you every flashback ever to explain all of your actions." This is actually a very badly written novel that we're describing.
It is quite bad.
But in a short story,
It also features the main character looking into a mirror to describe themselves.
I have blue eyes and red hair. I have a furrowed brow, as if I never smiled.
As you can see, this is a perfect description.
Yes, because I'm looking into a camera, not a mirror. I don't know what I look like. If I was a character in a novel, I also wouldn't know what I would look like.
What you described is exactly how you look.
Exactly.
Just FYI.
Oh, good to know, imaginary friend. Where was I? I had a train of thought, but you guys just robbed it.
I think basically the point you're trying to make, with the point that's, I feel like, broken record, that in a short story, you have, you focus on different parts. You focus on something more precise. You were saying there's more implied.
Yeah, like you have to guess at what the character's backstory is, unless the story is about their backstory. But
Yeah.
like
But the short story would not necessarily be about that. With a novel, as you're saying, like, you would put everything on the table. With a that is part of what.
Or not necessarily.
A lot of novels
it's to up your word count.
Exactly.
It's to up your word count.
Well, yes and no. You also, in a novel, you give yourself the freedom to present more of the world, more information, more background. Short story, it is a more economical format. Even if so, in that sense, I think you actually could have a short story that reaches novel length, but is constructed like a short story because of its focus.
Then wouldn't that just be a collection of short stories?
No,
in
not
which
a
the short
collection- not a
story is a
collection.
chapter.
Not a collection of short stories. A singular short story could be novel length, like up to 40,000 words.
But
if it's structured like short story and emphasizes the things that a short story would emphasize.
I disagree.
I
'cause-
wouldn't consider that either a
Yeah.
short story. I would consider that just a novel.
And then maybe one which has different focus.
Yeah.
Yeah, because if you
Essentially.
read the beginning chapters of novels, they sound like short stories. They, They have, a beginning, a rising action, and an end. And then you kind of get this feeling at the end where you're like, oh, wow, I would read more of this. And then there's another chapter, and you do. And then you actually start to get plot. Or like a TV series. The way that TV...
It's a little bit it's a little bit different.
I'm saying for how they're constructed. When you have like a pilot episode starting out, they're always self-contained. Because you need someone to be able to watch that episode and feel satisfied with that without just going, well, all these overarching plots are happening and I don't care enough to be invested.
Of course, now we're getting serial formats.
Yeah.
Which are like that anyway. You want within the serial format. And novels do have that somewhat within chapters per se. The chapters will be semi-self-contained and will have, and usually will have a lead into the next chapter.
That depends on the novel having chapters.
Which is
You
not
read
necessarily
anything by
required.
Terry Pratchett, he doesn't have chapters, he just has little dots.